I'm in this space where I want to know everything I need to know about what happened before so that I can help shape what needs to happen next. And you write about ever since those 20 some odd Negroes got off that boat, there's been a movement to free them. Talk about the early, because this country was built on the backs of enslaved labor, African labor primarily.
So, the enslaved people themselves were resisting what was being done to them from the beginning. We don't have a lot of archival material about their efforts, right? They were done in the holds of the slave ships and in acts of resistance on the indigo plantations and the tobacco, the early, the sugar especially. But we know that they were resisting, and when enough fugitive slaves got out so that they could start to write their story, then in their stories, they write really even well before the American Revolution, right? In the 18th century, well before 1776, there was slave literature, there was fugitive slave literature, and they write about their efforts to free themselves as normal. So from this, we can infer that they were widespread and of long standing. There was also in, let's see, so let's call it 1619, just to pluck a date from the ether.
Wait, because I'm smiling right now for a couple of reasons. Because history is put together by people in power,
And people
so
who have a pen.
and people who have a pen and the ability to disseminate such words right out into the so I imagine it was illegal for enslaved, because they were people. They weren't animals. They were in something happened to them. They were enslaved. They were enslaved. It was illegal for enslaved people to write and in many ways gather, communicate, and different because of the fear of revolt. Because revolt was as normal as you're pointing out,
Exactly.
as like they didn't just sing songs in the cotton fields and just accept their fate. They were
No,
fighting from day
and
one.
actually, to their credit, in among white people who are not themselves enslaved, the Quakers understood very early in their history that slavery was immoral and that it was a violation of the Christian religion, whatever your subset was. So, acts of resistance to slavery go way back before the period that I cover in my book. Haiti, the revolution in Haiti is way before the modern American abolitionist movement. But so there were resistances all along. The reason that I focused on the 30-year run up to the Civil War, to the Emancipation Proclamation, basically, is that I wanted to talk about a movement that succeeded. These individual acts of resistance, right? And I'm not fluent in French, so it would have been very hard for me to write about Haiti. But I do have English, and there are ample archives about the American abolitionist movement. So I focused on that because I wanted to look not at individual acts of running away and resistance, but at a movement acting collectively to abolish slavery. It seemed to me to be a worthy thing to look at. It is so interesting that you link the ability to read and write and communicate with the threat to the enslavement empire, because when in one of my characters, Frederick Douglass, was enslaved, and he was, I guess, fortunate in that universe of terror to be sent to Baltimore, where the family had not owned slaves and they didn't know how oppressive to be. So the mother of the family was teaching her little boy, her son, how to read. And so she started teaching Frederick Douglass his letters. And when her husband walked in and found her teaching Douglass how to read, he said, "You may not teach that slave how to read. A slave who reads is a slave who runs away." And Douglass says in his hello, memoir that he wrote, having the gift of letters starting at that moment, he said that seemed like a pretty good idea to him. So,
Right. So I've been reading, of course, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, John Brown. There were many attempts, not very successful, on the heels of the Haitian Revolution. Tell us a story that we don't know that you've written about in The Color of Abolition.
so I think the best untold story is the alliance between the free Blacks and fugitive slaves who formed the core of the Black abolitionist movement, the Black conventions, the Masonic lodges, and they pressed the white abolitionists heavily to move in a more radical direction. So there was an interaction between Black and white reformers that was unbelievably central and important to the accomplishment of emancipation. For example, maybe you don't know this story. There was a religious movement, the Second Great Awakening, which was both Black and white, by the way, in the early parts of the 1800s. And from the Second Great Awakening, one of the many social reform movements that the white people who ran it took up, they took up many, temperance, Bible reading. One of them was slavery. And their solution to the problem of slavery in America was that the slaves should be freed and sent back to Africa after living in America for hundreds of years, sometimes longer than the people who wanted to send them back to Africa. And this early emancipation movement was called colonization. And the organized Black abolitionists, especially in Boston and Philadelphia, and places where they could gather safely, relatively safely, caught wind of this colonization business. And they had a big meeting in which they had a vote. They actually voted. How many of you are in favor of going back to Africa or being sent back to Africa by our well-meaning white friends in the colonization movement? And they voted unanimously against colonization. And they shared their indignation and resentment at the suggestion that they, of all the Americans, should be sent back to where they came from, as opposed to the white English people being sent back to England or whatever, right? They shared that with the reformers who thought they were doing a good thing by freeing the slaves and sending them back to Africa. And it radicalized the white abolitionist movement. The white abolitionists listened to their Black colleagues who spoke out forcefully against this. And it started the movement that I write about in my book called the immediatist movement, for immediate abolition and not gradual abolition and the whitewashing of America through colonization. That interaction was immensely fruitful. And I see it throughout my book, okay? William Lloyd Garrison starts the Liberator newspaper in 1831. 10 years later, Frederick Douglass stands, having run away, exactly as his owner predicted, stands up at an abolitionist movement and gives a speech that left no heart unturned, it was reported. And Garrison meets him and he hires him immediately and sends him out on the speaker's trail. And there was no speaker more important in the night. There was no American more important in the 19th century than Frederick Douglass. And so this was a moment in which they could act together and make a better movement than either could do alone. So if I had to tell a story that I think is underreported, that might be the story. It's a great question to ask a writer. The other discovery that I made was of Maria Weston Chapman, the heavily underreported woman in the abolitionist movement. It should not surprise you to learn that mostly male historians went into the archives and somehow managed to not see Maria Weston Chapman. And right, and she was immensely important to the movement. She managed the speakers' tours. She had a waspish and terrible disposition, and she wrote shameful and hateful letters, which Frederick Douglass got wind of. So she played a central role in the breakup of the Boston abolition movement and Douglas's migration to the New York branch. And she ran the bazaars that raised the money that funded abolition. So she was a really important character in the story, and she's really overlooked. There's another woman historian, Lydia Mullen, who's writing a biography of another woman in abolition, Lydia Maria Child. And she and I have decided to join forces and try and remind people that you can't stop reporting the women's role in the history of these movements, because you lose a whole dynamic when you do that. So I would add that it's the collective action across racial lines. It worked brilliantly when it worked, but it was unsustainable in part because of the racism of the white abolitionists. People ask me, go ahead.
No, go ahead. People ask you.
People ask me, can you have interracial cooperation? Right? I spent 7 years studying the most effective interracial movement in American history. And my answer is yes and no.
Yes, I think so, because I think about John Brown. I think about John Brown a lot, actually, because that's what an ally, what an accomplice should look like today. If you're not engaged in the way John Brown engaged, and I'm not talking about, murder or anything, I'm talking about the kind of understanding of humanity that as long as anybody is suffering, as long as anybody's oppressed because of something as random as the color of your skin in this world, then you aren't really. And he was a fierce Christian, so he really was somebody that I know that it's possible. But I want to ask you this, Linda Hirshman, and she's the author, of course, of The Color of Abolition. As we fast forward to now, I see racism and racial dis-ease as central to the decimation of America.
Of course, it is the mortal sin of the American Republic. It is. So you look at a map. Just consider this. Look at a map of the states that are going to make abortion criminal after the Supreme Court finishes with busing children. That map looks like a map of the Confederacy, and the handful of states that the Confederate soldiers founded when they left after they lost the Civil War. So, of course, race is the mortal sin of the American Republic, and it endangers all of the Enlightenment values that we think we represent: self-governance and rights, individual rights, and equal justice before law. All of those things are threatened by the racism of the American Republic. But my movement has lessons for what we're facing now. Think about this. There were 12 white men in the basement of a black church, okay, that founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. 31 years later, the Emancipation Proclamation. Look at what they faced. Just think about what they faced. The Constitution was a slave document. It was a bargain with the planners. It was a slave document. The Constitution was completely against them. The enslavers, by virtue of the Constitution, controlled the White House and the House of Representatives, because they could, of course, vote their slaves' presence and the Senate because of the structure of the Senate. There were 4 million enslaved people. The economy of the United States of America rested on cheap cotton. So they were faced with all of those things. What we face today, Black people can vote, women can vote. I know it's harder, but they need to be organized to vote. It is a marathon, not a sprint. We are facing huge barriers, but it warms me to think about the barriers that the abolitionists overcame, right? They had a secret weapon, Frederick Douglass, and a secret woman, Maria Weston Chapman, but they did overcome them. And they were tremendous. So I want to hold out hope for the here and now and say, if the abolitionists could do it, we can do it. We need to be as committed as John Brown.
I used to be optimistic, Linda Hirshman. I'm not. Every day I get up and I'm looking at something as simple as the confirmation of a very qualified woman to sit on the Supreme Court that has turned into, to me, it's endemic of where we are right now. There's no logic. There's no reasoning. There's no rationale. At least the Constitution mattered to the people in the 1700s and 1800s in this country. There was an idealism around, a constitution, which is why a Thurgood Marshall could be confirmed without any problem whatsoever, widely confirmed in a country that was divided.
It was a brief moment in our history, okay? The Civil Rights, remember, I grew up in those years. The Civil Rights Movement was a brief exception to the long racist history of the United States. But we have to be prepared to deal with the reality of what we have in front of us now. And the abolitionists gave us tools: scribble, scribble, talk and talk, do retail politics, walk the sidewalks, find people where they live. Stacey Abrams is my idea of a modern incarnation of the abolitionist retail politicians. My not entirely flawless example, Maria Weston Chapman would walk the sidewalks of Boston and knock on the doors of the people who lived there and ask them to sign petitions to abolish the slave trade in our nation's capital. That's not different from what Stacey Abrams and her troops did in Georgia. So I believe that it's hard work, but I believe that those techniques are still relevant even now.
Okay. I want to hold on to, because you have studied and lived longer than I have and seen some things. Have you ever seen what we're experiencing right now, though?
No,
has it ever been this bad?
No, Linda, have not seen it. Remember, I was born in 1944, so until 2016, I had a life of peace and prosperity. And I saw the civil rights movement. I mean, I went to law school. I was one of 7 women in my class in law school because I was inspired. I had a sign on the wall of my office which said, "I did what I could with what I had." Do you know who said that? Thurgood Marshall said that. I did what I could with what I had. And so my life has been blessed by that exceptional period in American history. But so I never have. I will never forget election night 2016, although it was clearly coming. I mean, if you study history, you saw it coming, right? It wasn't like this came out of nowhere. It started in the John Birch Society in the 1950s. So the modern Republican Party was created by racist, bad actors in William Buckley's living room in the 1950s. And if you read the books they wrote, they were so staggeringly racist that you couldn't believe they were actually published in the 1950s, which was when Brown was decided. So yes, it was visible, but I've never seen it this bad. But when I went back to write my book, I saw what they were up against, and it was worse. It was worse, right? I mean, even in New York State, Black people couldn't vote unless they owned a certain, Black men couldn't vote, Black women couldn't vote at all.
Right.
Okay, Black men couldn't vote unless they owned a certain amount of land. So one of the real allies, a kind of a monetary John Brown, was a man named Gerrit Smith. He bought a huge tract of land upstate. They called it Timbuktu. And he gave pieces of land to Frederick Douglass, right? And to James McEwen Smith, and to the Black activists in New York so that they could vote. I see it as kind of an early version of reparations. It really was. He was such a good ally. So, I mean, there are possible things, right? Gave them land so they could vote. Technically, Black people can now vote since the 13th Amendment, the 14th and 15th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment for women. I know it's hard, and I know that it has been terrible these last few years, but I want to take a message of what we can do.
I appreciate that. And I think belief and faith has to power, it powers a whole lot. So we should not lose faith. We should not lose.
I wrote this book thinking, I wonder whether there's an interracial alliance. It would be interesting for me to write about, right? It was like 7 years ago. There was a very little, George Floyd stuff at that point. And I thought, I wonder wonder how this worked. And I knew that Douglas and Garrison had worked well and then badly. So I thought that would be interesting thing to look at. But of course, it turns out now it's horribly relevant. So we have to work together. I think your point about John Brown is excellent. I want to say I actually honor him for the violence that he ultimately deployed. By the time the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, there was no other response. When those slave catchers came north to take Black people back to the Gulag, they resisted with force, and they recognized that there was no alternative left for them. Frederick Douglass said, they're bloodhounds. They're going to act like bloodhounds. We're going to treat them like bloodhounds.